You are listening to Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. I'm your host, Josh Lucas, and at Method, our vision is to connect technology with humanity for a simpler digital future. Join us as we speak with leading experts to discuss industry trends, best practices, and emerging technology that can help you and your organization craft better digital products and experiences. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. I've been away from the show for a little bit. You're probably more used to hearing from this man right here, Jason Rome.
Sorry for that, everybody.
Yeah. And so we're going to do something a little bit different for today's episode. As we have wrapped up another year, we wanted to take just a few minutes to recap on how this past season of the Build What's Next podcast has gone. And so we wanted to take a look at a couple of our most listened to episodes, and it won't be a long episode for you today, but wanted to recap and go over what were some of those most listened to episodes, why we think that resonated so well. But then also we do have a special announcement for you on the back half. We'll be hearing from our head of marketing at GlobalLogic, Caroline Berger, who's going to be jumping on the show and sharing some great news with us that we're excited to share with you. So, Jason, we have 3 episodes that we're going to be reviewing. You are involved in 2 of the top 3 listened to episodes.
Just missed the cut.
Yeah.
Next year, we'll get them.
Yeah. So we're going to start off with our best performing, most listened to episode, which was involving Andy Busam and Bob Moesta. And it was specifically talking about the Jobs to Be Done framework. Bob was a super fascinating guy. He did a wonderful job. I loved listening to him. He also had done a tech talk for the company as well. If you haven't had a chance to go back and listen to that, I would highly recommend that. It was great information. He's worked with some amazing brands to help them work through this framework. So for those who aren't familiar with the Jobs to Be Done framework, it is based on the premise that people don't buy products, they hire them in specific situations to make progress. I'm on the marketing side. I'm not as in the weeds with a lot of the conversations that we're oftentimes having on this podcast. I'm curious, you on the other hand, the other side of the spectrum, you are always involved with the client work. Why do you think the Jobs to Be Done framework is such a powerful story for our audience to hear?
You know, after that tech talk, right, and the power of a good podcast or a power of a good tech talk is, does it change how you go about your day? And after that tech talk, I had a meeting with a client, I can't remember who, a couple days later, and something Bob had said in one of the stories he told resonated with me. And I actually went into that conversation thinking I had one solution, but I actually changed my approach and reframed how I was going to attack it. And so the sign of a great podcast or a great book or great tech talk is, do you use it in your day-to-day? And so I think that's one of the wonderful things. And I think specifically with jobs, and by the way, Andy got to spend some good time with Bob when he was in town. I think he's clearly done well for a reason in this space in his ability to tell stories and simplify things. So I think one is he's able to really simplify, and he has stories that really resonate for how to use this that you can immediately recognize. Sometimes books, speakers, processes, they can get a little intangible and they can feel academic sometimes, but Bob really brings them to life. And, after listening to him talk, you can go back to whatever problem you're trying to solve and apply it. And I think Jobs to Be Done is wonderful because it really gets to the kernel of what you are trying to solve for. And especially in today's often solution-driven landscape, all the work that's going on in AI, it's truer than ever that you need to fall in love with the problem, but it can be really hard to do that sometimes. And we see that with a lot of clients where you go in and you look at a strategy and it looks right on paper, but you start to ask some questions, you poke and prod at it and say, have we really established what we're trying to do here and what that looks like? And Bob has such a way of getting directly to that point and creating a really memorable story and narrative that drives some awesome solutions.
Well, and I think one of the things that I took away from it, which I feel like I've caught myself doing this a number of times on the marketing side, but it can be applied across the spectrum. The framework does a great job of walking you through how to make sure you're avoiding making assumptions on behalf of the client. And oftentimes making sure hey, if I do have these assumptions, can I validate them? Am I confident that moving forward with this approach is the right, or do I need to pivot? And so I would highly encourage our listeners, go back, listen to that episode. If you are in the digital space, which if you're listening to this, chances are you're doing a lot of that work. I really, really enjoyed not just the content he shared, but also just enjoyed Bob as a person. He is such a wonderful guy.
And so humble, I think, too. And you learn a lot about people and like why they're in this. And for him, the chapter of his career he's in is really about helping people and being a teacher and a mentor and using his stories to help organizations get there. And he's truly passionate about that and very genuine. And so, Bob, if you're listening out there, so thank you so much for this year.
Yes. Thank you, Bob. And again, if you have not listened to that, go back. It's episode 4 in the Build What's Next podcast series. So our second most listened to podcast. It was a 2-part series with you and David Brown. And so we were unpacking strategy and discovery around modern product. And so we've done a number of early episodes where very specific to just the approach that you take, the pillars that you try to implement when you're focused on modern product. And so David is a great friend of Method and loved having him on the podcast. He's also done a couple tech talks for us. And so you can check out those as well if you're interested in more content beyond the podcast episode. But Jason specifically, and we'll go ahead and spoil number 3 since they are part of the same, 2 sides of the same coin, but unpacking strategy and discovery as well as unpacking delivery and culture. So walking through those 4 pillars there, why are they so important to you? You helped package this up as far as Method's perspective on this, but why are they so critical, not only to how we work, but also to just the way that the clients are engaging with us?
Yeah. And also late breaking news, but since we did that podcast, we've added a 5th pillar. So planning is now in an ecosystem. So strategy, discovery, planning, and culture. Planning was it was living in too many places and it's deserved its own. So welcome planning. We'll do a planning podcast next year.
Yeah, that's another episode on the way.
David's another person that every time I have a conversation with him, I learn something. And we usually exchange 2 to 3 book ideas with each other.
Which, just spoiler alert, if you're watching this, we have a lot of books. Most of these books I stole from Jason's desk to populate the backdrop here.
I've been slowly stealing them back.
I've noticed it's been getting a little thinner. I'm going to have to go book hunting, but sorry.
I think for why these pillars are important is a lot of times when you meet with an organization and when you meet with the product team and then the design team, the technology team, the business team, and when you review their portfolio of initiatives, if you look at each initiative and each set of practices and the foundations of what they're doing, and you look at all these different systems, when you look at each of them independently, each of these looks pretty good. It's following general best practices. It's aligned to what we want to do. When you look at the connective tissue between those systems, that's where things start to break down. And a lot of maturity frameworks that are out there for operating models focus on maturing the individual pillar, but don't always look at its role within the broader ecosystem. And where we see things break down is, how those systems partner together. And also, are they the right systems for that company? There's a lot of frameworks and there's certifications and there's a lot of quote unquote best practices. One of the things that we've probably said many times on the podcast, because tendency to repeat myself, is there are no best practices, there are only better practices. And I see a lot of organizations trying to adopt practices that aren't the right ones for what they're trying to accomplish from a business perspective. And so looking at where is the break, and when we do our maturity assessments, a lot of delivery issues are upstream, where the alignment wasn't good, the strategy wasn't sound, discovery wasn't complete, the planning process didn't manage dependencies right. So that by the time it gets to the development team, the requirements aren't quite there, non-functional requirements were an afterthought. The architecture solution doesn't fit in with the rest of what's going on. There's multiple dependencies. And so that's why all those pillars and looking holistically at it is so important when we think about that.
Yeah. And I think you guys did a great job of breaking it down. Again, if you haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, I would highly recommend going back. And we try and break that up into a little bit more bite-sized content. There's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack. But I think you guys did a great job of, as somebody who's not as engrossed in that world as you guys clearly are, it was easy for me to make sure that I was still following along. And I think even for the folks who are doing this day in and day out, you're certainly going to have a lot to take away as not just refreshers, but also just, I think, a lot of interesting learnings.
Yeah, I think kudos to you for being able to cut that into a coherent set of thoughts, because he and I have a tendency to ramble and go from thing to thing and jump around a little bit there. One of the things that stands out for me, and it's a quote from David that he said to me when we were prepping for that I've continued to use throughout the year, specifically about discovery, is that discovery is not free. And I love that quote. And I use it all the time. So thank you, David. And it really resonates with folks. A lot of times we're so focused on tracking the velocity and the allocation of our development teams and like what they're actually building. that we don't appropriately question the quality of our discovery work sometimes. And there's a lot of discovery that goes out and talks to users and finds great insights and reviews data, but never gets to the point where it's being used as evidence to help make a decision. And a lot of organizations we talk to now, the discovery and the research budgets aren't maybe what they used to be in the past. They're overwhelmed by data. They have a lot of strategies they're trying to execute. And so since that podcast over the course of the year, as we've been having conversations, looking at discovery specifically of what are your highest impact initiatives that you're trying to do with the highest degree of uncertainty that are going to have the highest cost, and looking at discovery as almost a form of insurance of, hey, to drive this benefit and make sure that the money that we are spending is going to have the highest impact, we're going to do discovery here because it's going to reduce our risk of either not reaching that impact or spending too much or underspending to make sure it's allocated right. And that's really resonated since then. I think it's very easy, especially in discovery, to say, well, this is best practices. Go talk to your customers and personas and journey maps and all of that work. But a lot of times discovery comes out and it can't get integrated into the rhythm of business of how we're delivering. And so that was one of the things that David said. And when we talk about discovery, just being a lot more intentional about it, I think is a still important lesson going into 2025.
Yeah. And a couple things that I had noted in here that I thought were just great highlights. At one point, I think you guys were discussing that not every feature needs to be delightful. Some should just work seamlessly. And I think especially in the digital world where we're so caught up in everything has to have its special moment, everything has to have this little instance of magic. And sometimes sometimes people just want to get through the process. They don't want to be entertained the entire time. Just make it work seamlessly, get them to the end as fast as possible. I thought was an interesting takeaway. And then another one that you were alluding to there, which was nothing is truly proven until it's in production and being used by actual customers.
Yeah. It's one of the questions I like to ask folks of, hey, we're going to go do discovery, right? What do we know right now? And what would we find during discovery that's going to change our mind? Because you do discovery and there's just a lot of stuff in the middle where you still have to make a decision. If you go test a feature and, 6 out of 10 people liked it. What do we do with that? Is that good? What about 3 out of 10? Do we care about that 30%? Is it statistically significant? And so a lot of times we're hoping that discovery gives us a crisp answer, but there's still a lot to determine there. But in a lot of cases, also when you're talking to someone, who people think they are and how they think they're going to behave versus what they actually do, especially in certain fields like finance and healthcare, right? Where the aspirational view of an individual versus their kind of actual day-to-day life is different. Sometimes you're not going to figure it out until you're in production. And so let's accelerate getting this to prod and setting ourselves up to really learn from that release. And that's not a mode people always have as an organization. Discovery is still seen as something before delivery versus let's deliver to be able to learn. And even when people talk about MVPs or POCs or that type of thing, it's usually talked about in terms of delivering sooner, not optimizing learning sooner, is something I see a lot in the market right now.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably a great place for us to wrap up because I don't want to go too in the weeds with each episode. This is hopefully a highlight for...
I want to go extremely deep in the weeds. Let's do another episode right now.
I know you would be willing to do that. For the folks who are listening right now, this hopefully just whets your appetite a little bit. Go back, check out those episodes. Again, that was David Brown and Jason Rome on Modern Product. There are 2 different episodes there for that. And then also Andy Busam, Bob Moesta, and myself were on the Jobs to be Done framework, which I think hopefully you have a lot of great content there that can help you out with your day-to-day work in the digital space. So stay tuned. Jason, thank you so much for joining us here. As always, you've been such a huge blessing to what we're doing here on the show and very grateful for your perspective and your time that you share with us here. And stay tuned. We're going to have Caroline Berger, the marketing director for GlobalLogic, is going to be joining us here shortly, and we have some great news to share with you with her. We'll be back in just 1 second. We are very excited for you to get to hear from somebody very special to the company. We're sitting down now with Caroline Berger, who is the Chief Marketing Officer for GlobalLogic. Caroline has been a wonderful addition to the team. There's been a lot of behind the scenes efforts that are going to start rolling out in the very near future for our listeners from the way that GlobalLogic looks and sounds, and she's been the engine behind all of that work that's been taking place. So we're very excited for you to see. That'll be coming up in the very near future as we get ready to roll out some of those efforts. Caroline, I want to give a second for the group to get to know you. So I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into kind of what that relationship between GL and Method looks like and some exciting news for the podcast here. But before we get into that, I want to just pause and ask if you can introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about who you are and the role you've been playing for the last year.
Thanks, Josh, and thank you for having me. I've been listening actively to Build What's Next since it launched, and I'm excited to see where it goes and really honored to see it expanding into the GlobalLogic family more broadly. So, as you said, I am the Chief Marketing Officer for GlobalLogic. I joined GlobalLogic just over a year ago, and I was really brought on to help look at how marketing can become a growth driver for GlobalLogic. We are fully owned by Hitachi, our parent company, and there is a huge amount of effort and focus on GlobalLogic driving the digital agenda for Hitachi. So that really excites me, and there's so much potential. And we aren't going to get to our growth agenda and growth targets without Method, because Method is really at the forefront of so many of the projects, the work, and the client relationships that we have.
If I can jump in there, I think that's probably a great tee up for us. For the listeners who have been participating in the content that we've been putting out there for the last year, I know the folks close to the company, the employees here, everybody is well aware, but there's probably folks outside of the organization who maybe aren't as familiar of the relationship between GlobalLogic and Method. And so this might be a good opportunity for us to share some of that. And so a few years ago, Method was acquired by GlobalLogic. And GlobalLogic, for those who are not aware, is really one of the leaders in the digital engineering space and has done a wonderful job of building this reputation and this portfolio of work with working with some of the largest companies in the world on some extremely innovative digital products, platforms, services. And so Method just made sense to become a part of that. And as you said, has been helping to lead the way in a lot of the projects within the GlobalLogic portfolio. I'm curious to just know your thoughts as we have had the time now. You've been here for quite a bit now, and seeing that relationship unfold between Method and GlobalLogic and knowing the content that we're trying to create for this podcast moving forward, I'm pretty excited about the opportunities that this relationship brings. And so what we're really trying to get to here is that Method is now going to have a presenting sponsor, which is GlobalLogic. So our parent company is going to officially come in and partner with us to help us bring you hopefully even better content than we've already been doing. Caroline, I'm just curious to see your thoughts as we've been planning some of what is to come on the podcast, just your thoughts on what that relationship looks like moving forward and what potential that might have for the content we're trying to bring to the audience.
Absolutely. So as you said, Josh, GlobalLogic is the trusted digital engineering partner to some of the world's largest, most forward-thinking companies, and has always been at the cutting edge of digital experiences. And when we acquired Method, we strengthened that capability so significantly. In fact, we were one of the first digital software engineering companies to think about and to actually acquire a design arm. And so where I get most excited is I think about GlobalLogic's unique strengths. They exist at the intersection of engineering, design, and data. And it's really at that intersection that we are able to create amazing products, platforms, and services. And so when we leverage our design ecosystem, we're integrating design and engineering from the inception. Clients and our partners can actually have confidence in the products and platforms that we're building. They are designed for desirability. They're designed not just for the feasibility of working, but actually to ensure that the people and processes and everything that are touching those products and platforms are getting the experience that they need, want, or desire. And so with that in mind, as we work with our clients at that intersection of engineering, design, and data, I think about the guests that we can have on this podcast. I think about the stories we can tell. And it's the magic that happens at that intersection.
And I think this is hopefully mutually beneficial for both Method and GlobalLogic. Method moving forward, I think have the ability to leverage some of the relationships that GlobalLogic has, and then also GlobalLogic being able to benefit from a lot of the leadership within some of the strategy and design work that we've been already in the process of putting out over the last year. There's a lot of overlap. So a lot of this isn't necessarily going to be that there's brand new that we're bringing to it, but hopefully it just gives us even deeper opportunity to dive into some of these subject matters and more voices to start pulling from, which I'm very excited about.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that, Josh, right? I think our industry depth and experience within GlobalLogic is one that I hope the listeners will value from, because we work across almost every industry out there, right? And so the ability to think about the different industry-led stories and guests that we can bring, and Hitachi, right? Bringing Hitachi experts to the table will be great.
Yeah. Well, Caroline, I appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your very busy schedule to join and just share this exciting news with the listeners. And so again, moving forward, as you start to hear hopefully more and more voices on even wider array of subjects, we will be excited for a lot of those voices to be from the GlobalLogic side of the company. And so very excited about that. And I hope that our listeners are as well. And so again, thank you all for listening for this latest episode of Build What's Next, Digital Products, Product Perspectives, presented by GlobalLogic. And Caroline, thank you again for taking time out of your day to join us for a few minutes. Thank you for joining us on Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. If you would like to know more about how Method can partner with you and your organization, you can find more information at method.com. Also, don't forget to follow us on social and be sure to check out our monthly Tech Talks. You can find those on our website. And finally, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. We'll see you next time.